Okay, I'll introduce myself. I'm Elliott Colla from the Department of Arabic here at Georgetown University. I want to begin my comments, after Bassam I need to raise the microphone just a little bit. I want to begin my comments tonight thinking about Matthew Arnold, a 19th century English poet and literary critic who watched as new social classes began to exert themselves in the English polity and began to reflect on this. This is precisely the same process that E.P. Thompson was reflecting on in his work. For Arnold, this process was alarming. It was a potential threat to what it meant to be English, and for him, culture could be used as a weapon. He used the word culture as a weapon to fight this new class war. The title of his book, Culture and Anarchy, was exactly that, on the one posing a very stark choice between, on the one hand, culture and on the other hand, anarchy. On the one hand, the order that people had known as what England was, and the new anarchy posed by new classes of Englishmen demanding to be recognized as citizens. In Latin America, the same bifurcation and use of culture comes out in phrases like civilization and barbarism. In Egypt, it has reared its head in very interesting ways, and I want to talk about those today. Culture is really not the issue of the revolutionary movements we are watching in Tunisia and Egypt, but culture is much a part of how these movements are unfolding in two ways. First, even if the state promotion of official culture in authoritarian regimes of the Arab world is not the explicit issue of this revolutionary moment, it does have something to do with what is happening right now. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But if you've been watching Al Jazeera, you've been listening to poetry. Those slogans that you're hearing are actually poetic couplets. They rhyme, they're really creative, and they're really fun to listen to as well. The second point I want to make that I'm going to begin with tonight is that from the very beginning, people with very little understanding of the movements or very little sympathy for them have often decided to shift discussion away from what the protesters are saying and toward vague conversations about culture, Egyptian culture, Arab culture, the culture of Islam, and so on. Now, while often meaningless, this outpouring of culture talk is by no means without significance or usefulness. Let me show one use. The demands of the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt have been pretty straightforward. First of all, an immediate end to the tyrannical regime, first of Ben Ali and second of Mubarak, an end to one-party rule, an end to police brutality and official corruption, more transparency and accountability, and increased meaningful participation of ordinary citizens in the process of governance. Obviously, the details of the demanded changes might be complicated. We could get into that. But there is absolutely nothing ambiguous about the demands themselves. They don't need to be translated, even though an op-ed piece today in the New York Times attempted to translate Horeya as freedom, as if we somehow didn't know what people were talking about in Tahrir. No one can say that these demands are culturally specific. It doesn't mean they're universal, but that the important thing is they're not necessarily culturally specific. It also seems that culture, in other words, would have very little explanatory for the situation. But surprisingly, or not really to me, since I study this, culture was front and center in Hosni Mubarak's sole English language public response to the revolt. And supposedly he told Christiane Amanpour that, and I quote here, "If I resign now, there will be chaos, and I'm afraid the Muslim Brotherhood will take over. I said to Obama, you don't understand the Egyptian culture, and you do not understand what would happen if I resigned today." Culture or anarchy? Civilization or barbarism? We've seen this before. Now, the mention of Egyptian culture in this interview figured as a way to change the channel from the issues at hand, issues which are crystal clear. we shouldn't miss the fact that Mubarak has been talking exactly this way for 30 years now, telling Egyptians and the world that with his regime, they'll get stability, and with the existing alternatives, his code word for the Muslim Brotherhood, they'd get nothing but chaos and ruin. It's a 30-year-old policy of fear-mongering, and incidentally, this is the same message that has always been at the core of the regime's official cultural policies that I'll get to soon. It is also worth noting that this choice between stability and chaos has roots in a very old colonial habit of talking about Egypt, and directly links the attitudes of, say, Lord Cromer, Egypt's colonial viceroy under British rule, who used to talk about the unruly natives understanding only the whip. It links that kind of attitude to the many commentators here who talk about the Muslim Brotherhood as if it were a nefarious monster that had suddenly gotten loose in some bad neighborhood. Mubarak's arrogant remarks about the demonic culture of Egyptians were carefully chosen to resonate with this old tradition of Islamophobia in the West, and it has to a certain extent. But Mubarak's words were also intended to resonate with an old tradition of state paternalism within Egypt. Now, this goes back to what James was talking about, the state and the republic, that the state, it's some instances in Egypt, has put itself forward as the strong father, certainly throughout the 19th century colonial period, and even before, under Muhammad Ali, but even within the post-independence period, under Gamal Abdel Nasser. By this, I'm referring to the way in which there circulates a belief that the Egyptian people need a powerful state to get things done. The Egyptian state, or the idea that the Egyptian state takes care of its citizens and provides for them, or that Egyptians really cannot be expected to run their own society. Unlike previous eras of authoritarian rule, under Mubarak, only a very small fraction of Egyptians have benefited from the role that the state plays in the economy. Many of them, these who have benefited, have been taking their money out of the country as fast as they can in recent weeks, fixing up their houses in Dubai, and perhaps even contacting SFS for positions. But the vast majority of Egyptians would not be mistaken to believe that they benefit very little from the state. And here, this goes back to what Bassam was talking about in terms of the economic reforms under the IMF neoliberal plans starting really in the 1990s. In terms of public education, just to list some things we might associate with state, with benefits that might accrue from a state. In terms of public education and healthcare, state services have been abysmal for decades. The salaries of doctors and teachers working in the public sector are at the subsistence level, and most public schools and hospitals are a risk to public health. It's not for nothing that Egyptians joke about the Arabic word for hospital, mustashfa, and call it mishtashfa. You won't get better, in fact. And with some of the highest pollution rates in the globe, it's also not a surprise that Egyptians suffer huge rates of cancer and kidney disease, some of the highest in the world. The transportation infrastructure is likewise in tatters, and road fatalities remain a leading cause of death among Egyptians. Sorry about this. So to say that Egypt's infrastructure has been crumbling under Mubarak is not really a metaphor. It is literally the case. Egypt has been collapsing since the late 1980s and certainly since the early 1990s. When a powerful, to give an event that really brought this home, a 5.9 degree earthquake hit Cairo in September 1992. 370 people were killed and roughly 10 times that number badly injured. While the cause of the event was natural, the disaster in many ways was man-made. An inept and corrupt system of building permits and inspection meant that hundreds, if not thousands, of subpar, large-scale buildings in urban Egypt had been built. And so when the earthquake happened, I remembered it vividly. It was terrifying. The state had virtually no ability to respond to it at all. Most of the first responders were citizen volunteers. Medical and humanitarian aid was provided largely by NGOs, including many run by the Muslim Brothers. Many Egyptians would never forget the lesson during that month. When disaster struck, the Muslim Brothers and other groups were there. The state was almost nowhere to be seen. Promises to rebuild the damage, especially in the heritage districts of Cairo, have been slow in coming. Now, 19 years later, many buildings, such as this one in the Khayyamiyya area of Darb al-Ahmar, remain in dangerous disrepair. And because of a lack of governmental oversight for building and maintenance, Egypt does not need earthquakes for this to happen. So I'm just going to give you some highlights of this. 2003, the last slide, 2004, 2007. Every few months, a building falls down in Egypt, leading to the deaths of many. Their cause invariably is connected to contractors having bribed their way around state building codes. In this history of slow collapse, though, the 2008 landslide that demolished Dumaika, a slum of Manshiat Nasr, is most telling. The disaster left 119 people dead and thousands of people homeless. What was not immediately apparent from this building, from the beginning, is that once again, this disaster was likely man-made. Manshiat Nasr, here on the right, and the slum of Dumaika in it, stand at the foot of the Muqattam Hills. In recent years, the empty bluffs, the site of the development projects sponsored by the IMF and other international economic actors, encouraged fierce real estate speculation and development for elite housing. New homes for elites who were seeking to flee the crowded city began to be built. New gated communities went up, along with all the trappings of good life. Local residents of Manshiat Nasr had complained that water seepages through the cliffs began soon after the development began, weakening the soil and rocks in the neighborhoods above the neighborhood of Dumaika. When the enormity of the disaster caught international attention, even Amnesty International got involved because it was clear to them that some of this had to do with building schemes sponsored by the government, which is to say some of the ruling cronies. The government finally initiated an investigation. The cause, they later determined, was fate. All of this raised the important point. What benefits has the state brought most Egyptians under Mubarak's rule? The historian of Egypt, Sumaya Hamdani, a colleague of ours at George Mason University, has reflected powerfully on this issue just last week, and she shared me her thoughts. I want to read them. She writes, "One of the achievements of the protest has been to show the irrelevance of the Mubarak state itself. Over the last 2 weeks, Egyptians have shown an incredible degree of self-reliance, a renewed sense of community and nation. Streets have been patrolled. Food and medicine have been distributed. Garbage collected have all been undertaken without the police, the army, or any other state institution. In particular, Tahrir Square itself has taken on the attributes of an independent and sovereign state. The people within it have established their own borders, evolved their own army and arsenal for defense, their own foreign policy with regard to those outside it, their own police for the maintenance of law and order and detention of enemies within it, a system for the distribution of food, shelter, and medical care, and for their own fora for public expression, given lie to the assumptions of the paternalistic state. The Egyptian people have clearly shown they don't need it." This is actually quite remarkable. In fact, the violence, the need for protection wasn't, the Egyptians got together, banded together to protect themselves from the state. They didn't need it. In fact, the state clearly here has been the problem. Now, I want to argue in what follows is that what developed was, in the last couple weeks, is really a do-it-yourself spirit. I want to quote one of my favorite Twitters that came out of the Twitter feed of Gamal Eid, who is a human rights activist. Twittering, he writes from the Min Nawadir Tahrir, from the interesting anecdotes of Tahrir Square. He writes, seeing a boy who says, "Ana shab sis, bantaloni wa'a, ihna amelna sawra huna." Into ameltu eh? I'm a poor street kid. My pants are falling down. We just made a revolution here. What have you done? And this is the kind of attitude that you see springing up all over the place. Now, I want to say a couple words about state and culture that I began with. I want to ask you to consider something slightly remarkable, in my opinion. On Friday, a week ago Friday, Mubarak fired his previous cabinet and installed a new one. He filled 5 of the top posts with 3 generals, a former ambassador and crony, and one of his close businessmen friends, or business associates, I guess. Then, while 30 other key ministry posts remained vacant, Mubarak appointed Gabr Asfour as the new Minister of Culture, and also created a new Ministry of Antiquities headed by the media celebrity and one-time Egyptologist Zahi Hawass. The politicization of the Ministry of Culture is nothing new. During the early 1990s, the Mubarak regime began to face serious threats to its rule by an Islamist insurgency, fueled by the kind of social divisions that Bassam was talking about. And it suddenly discovered the glories of secular Enlightenment culture. It began to seek new allies among writers and artists. It was an unlikely marriage, given the repression, control, and censorship under the arts suffered by Mubarak and suffered under Mubarak and the 2 military dictators that preceded him. But there were carrots and sticks. These same intellectuals were high-profile targets of a vicious campaign launched by Islamists, who faulted them for their supposedly godless secularism. During this time, one prominent intellectual, Farag Foda, was assassinated. A second, Naguib Mahfouz, barely survived an attempt on his life. And other leading intellectuals like Nasser Hamad Abu Zaid, Sayyid al-Imni, also faced serious threats to their life, while many others, filmmakers and artists, suffered serious harassment, legal harassment, personal harassment, career harassment, abuse, and worse. The response of the Mubarak regime to the crisis then was deliberately ambiguous. On the one hand, it waged a deliberate and nasty low-level war against the Islamists in the urban slums and in rural southern Egypt. It also increased investment in the official state religious institutions, Al-Azhar most especially, presenting itself as the true representative of moderate Islam, while attempting to co-opt and outflank the moral positions held by Islamist critics. And on the other hand, it opened new investments in the Ministry of Culture, headed for many years by the colorful and divisive artist Hosni Farouk. Throughout the 1990s, the Ministry of Culture built and rebuilt institutions like the Cairo Book Fair, the Culture Palaces, and the Cairo Opera. While once important theaters fell into disrepair and eminent museums like the Cairo Museum began to molder and libraries like Dar al-Qutb nearly collapsed, the ministry busied itself with flashy new projects that ranged from the sublime, like the new Alexandria Library, to the banal, like Suzanne Mubarak's Reading for All series of cheap paperbacks. But, and besides these activities, there were opportunities for employment and reward for many. In the literary sector, the one I know best, the ministry's agencies developed new publishing venues and prize competitions. In this, Egypt is not alone. This is precisely what ministries of culture have done across the Arab world. And the example I'm giving you about Egypt is one that could, that actually is quite close to many other situations, from the Gulf to Morocco. Many writers who might have otherwise been unemployed or employed elsewhere were brought into a subsistence relationship to their new government patrons. And thus, within a decade, the state went from being one of the chief obstacles to cultural production to one of its chief protectors and subsidizers. And this would have profound effect in terms of buying and co-opting and bringing intellectuals into the state fold. Given the eclectic and shallow character of many of its activities, it's really unclear whether or not they were ever working from a single strategic plan. However, whatever they were doing, there was a single rhetoric, and that was this, that the Egyptian nation was engaged in a battle for its life, and that on one side stood the forces of religious ignorance, and on the other, the forces of secular enlightenment, right? And Osama was talking precisely about this bifurcation of secular authoritarianism versus religious threat on the other. Now, as I said, this tale of the Egyptian Ministry of Culture is not significantly different from the way other ministries have not only politicized knowledge and expressive culture, but also weaponized it. The ministries of culture in other authoritarian regimes in the Arab world play the same role, attempting to divide and co-opt intelligentsia and to busy them with anything other than asking for change. So in this sense, we can almost say that the division of culture and anarchy that proposed by Matthew Arnold, in light of the kind of state violence brought to bear and the way in which the state brought culture into that war, simply doesn't hold. If anything, state culture at least, was a significant part of the state program, which is one of violence, even anarchy. To conclude, I want to say a couple pieces of good news. First of all, state culture was never really a deep culture in these places, and there has always existed outside and alongside it a very vibrant popular culture, some of it classical, some of it colloquial. And this is in fact what is coming to the fore right now from the protesters marching in the streets of Tunisia and Egypt. And they are mobilizing old and new forms of expressive culture. I've mentioned the slogans that are being chanted are really poetry. There are bands playing right now in Tahrir Square as we speak, and this is happening all over Egypt, from what I understand. In other words, there's good reason to think that after this movement, the relationship of Egyptians towards culture is one that is going to probably be characterized by this very same do-it-yourself spirit. We don't need a ministry of culture to tell us what good poetry is. We don't need to believe in a bifurcated world of culture versus anarchy. And that this poetry of the revolution itself, in fact, is a good and beautiful thing. I'm going to stop there and leave us room for questions and answers. Thank you.